From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. This episode of Blue Sky begins with a confession. When a friend first suggested that I interview today's guest, I wasn't sure this was a good idea. Oren Segal works at the Anti-Defamation League, and this wasn't feeling like it would be a conversation brimming with hope and optimism. But after speaking with Oren directly, I realized he is just the type of person I want to profile on this show. As Vice President of the Center on Extremism, Oren Segal leads ADL's efforts to combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Much of Oren's time with ADL has been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, working with law enforcement and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. He regularly appears on national and international media outlets, provides expert witness testimony at congressional hearings, and speaks at conferences around the world. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest. He was named to the Forward's list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. Oren joined ADL after working for the New York Times. He's a graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts. After reflecting on Oren and his work, I was reminded of the great Fred Rogers and something he said about helpers. When I was a boy, he said, and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." This reflection applies to many of the people we profile on Blue Sky. They know there are scary and difficult things going on in the world, but they choose to suit up and be helpers. My guest today is one of these people. Oren Segal, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
We have a lot to cover today, and I just wanted to start with understanding your background and what it was that drew you to this work that you're doing today.
I have always had perhaps a morbid intellectual curiosity about the dark side of things. Ever since I was a young kid, growing up in New York City. What makes New York both challenging for people, but also great for natives like myself, is that there is a lot going on, some scary stuff, a lot of hope. And perhaps, seeing that every day in my formative years brought me to a place where, I'm able to work on very dark topics, but with the goal of doing it to create some peace, some hope, some stability in the world, right? So I can't think of a better type of job for that, 7-year-old New Yorker many years ago than saying, hey, you can satiate your morbid curiosities, but also be able to see the good at the end of the day.
And so tell us, if you could, some of the more details about your work. So you are with the Anti-Defamation League. You are, I assume, looking for these bad actors out there, trying to undermine their efforts, potentially work with law enforcement. Can you give us the range of things that you work on?
Yeah, so I'll start with what the ADL is. This is a 100-plus-year-old organization whose mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. So, these sort of very almost prescient mission from over 100 years ago recognized that the only way that you combat anti-Semitism or threats against the Jewish people is to fight against bigotry and hatred of all kinds. And to fight those hatreds, you must find ways to push back against anti-Semitism. So it's kind of a dual mission, but I really see it as one sort of fundamental mission, is to help make sure people are feeling safe and secure in their society. And that, for those that may feel isolated or targeted, that there's a way to find sort of hope and not have to sort of exist like that for good. Part of what ADL does, and the part of ADL's work that I oversee, is our Center on Extremism. And so this is a team made up of, 40 plus analysts and investigators, people who are dedicating their lives to understanding how extremism works, how extremists operate both online and on the ground, the narratives of hate and efforts to undermine democracy, how that is incubated in online spaces, and how it animates real world activity. But at the end of the day, it's not just to understand it. It's about how do we take our learnings, the findings every day, and turn that into something better. How do we work with protecting communities by letting law enforcement know about threats? How do we work with the tech industry to make sure that they have the data they need in order to be able to stop the exploitation of their platforms? And how do we find ways to provide actionable information and even education to the general public so that everybody feels like they have a stake in the fight against extremism and hate? Frankly, that last part, to me, means the most, because it's not just about, all right, I know the latest tactics and threats and terrible things that have happened. It's like, no, what are we doing with that information to make people feel not only like aware, but that they want to be part of a movement to make the world a better place?
And I think the awareness is a huge part. In that word extremists, these are on extreme fringes of social media, frankly, too. You gave a great testimony late last year in Congress, and you started talking about these platforms that folks are using. I heard of maybe one of them, 4chan, it's not. I assume people are using Facebook and Twitter and some of the other things, but there are these are using Discord and things like that were set up for gamers. There's this whole world out there that a lot of folks listening to this podcast would not know about. Can you sort of shed some light on that? And what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I often joke that the spaces online that my investigators and analysts are spending a good portion of their time is the same spaces that my two young children are spending their time, right? Hate and extremism, those who promote it are often early adopters to the latest technology because they're trying to constantly find ways to, reach, recruit, and radicalize people. And so, sure, most of your listeners have heard of, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and these sort of long established platforms at this point that we know hate still exists on, that bad actors still rely on to communicate. But more and more, there's a whole sort of menu of smaller niche platforms that we all use for different things every single day, but that includes extremists, right? And so to really get a handle on not just sort of what these groups are planning and thinking and doing, but really their ability to have their ideas normalized requires understanding the various platforms that they're on. And so, without sort of trying to be hyperbolic, your audience should think of the 10 most niche platforms they can think about that they think nobody's ever heard of. And I can guarantee you, we have heard of it, and we are looking for extremists on it.
Right. And in those cases, we think about legislation and folks like Meta and others taking more responsibility for these things. These other platforms, are these sort of mom and pop operations? Are these, did they tree up to bigger organizations that should be doing a better job? Where do these come from?
Yeah, I mean, some of these are, perhaps subsidiaries of others, but a lot of these are, it's not as hard to create your own social media platform these days as it was 10 years ago. And it's kind of a funny sentence to say, but it's true. And so certainly all these platforms need to be hosted, right? There's certain sort of shared services, whether financial or others, that are part of sort of the ecosystem in which these platforms exist. But some of them are very clearly about creating alternatives to platforms that make it difficult or try to make it difficult for hate and militant ideas to spread. I'm not gonna name them here because I don't want to give them more attention, but there are certain platforms that are by and for extremists, and the ease in which they're able to create these platforms, have chat rooms and video sharing and all the bells and whistles that you'll find on your most favorite app or website. It's easy to create that for and by extremists, and some of them have millions of followers, millions of users.
Oren laughs when he describes being a child with a morbid curiosity about the dark side. Fortunately for us, he channeled this interest not in contributing to this darkness, but instead, as he says, toward creating peace and hope. And I was amazed to learn that there's a group of 40-plus people in ADL's Center on Extremism doing this work to protect our communities. And while the Anti-Defamation League was founded to battle anti-Semitism, their work has broadened, and Oren emphasizes that everybody has a stake in their efforts to ensure that targeted groups of all kinds feel safe and secure. And now back to our conversation and a discussion about some of the more well-known entities that provide online platforms for some of the bad actors whom ADL is taking on. And some still, though, are sort of hiding in plain sight on the more established platforms, though, right? I mean, one of the things I think is frustrating for a lot of us, and I have a more traditional media background, I've always scratched my head at how Facebook in particular can get away with, all this content that comes in from others. They monetize it. They don't even pay for it. And then they don't properly police it. And so how much of it falls at the foot of these companies who should know better, in my opinion, and use their resources to crack down on this more effectively?
Yeah, Bill, it's just not unreasonable for users to have an expectation of these platforms that are making billions of dollars to invest the time and energy and money to do a better job of seeing how bad actors are exploiting those platforms. The challenge is many companies, I think, if you're threatening somebody with violence or, posting a video of a mass shooting, generally the established platforms, want to identify that and take it down. But when we know that there are narratives that animate people to hate or violence, but that are not necessarily illegal and not necessarily so blatant for an average user, that's where this becomes complicated, right? Because it's finding the worst of the worst is easy, but in America, you can be as hateful as you want to be. And even though certain narratives we believe, platforms have a choice of whether they want to amplify them or not, the challenge people have is not even the ability to recognize hate, because that's how, in a way, omnipresent it has become because of these platforms. So last point I'm going to say about this, that all that being said, companies should do more. It should be part of their business plan. They should put people over profits, and they shouldn't allow their algorithms, for example, to curate the worst of the worst. They should create mechanisms in order to prevent people from going down a hateful rabbit hole, especially if they weren't even looking for it in the first place.
Right. No, and I cringe sometimes too when some of those platforms will sort of cloak themselves in the First Amendment, because it was Sacha Baron Cohen actually who used this analogy that I loved in a talk somewhere, and he said, if I run a restaurant and three guys come in Nazi uniforms and start abusing the Jewish patrons, I kick them out. Now they can go yell in the street, that's First Amendment, but not on my property. It's private property. This is my business. Get out. And so I worry sometimes too. We just say First Amendment, and say, well, no, you're a private entity, you're a business. You can kick them out if you want. And I wish there was more of that. But at the same time, in your work, the First Amendment is a tricky thing, I'm sure. And I'd love to know how you push back other than raising awareness.
Yeah, to add just a fine point to what you were saying, I think it's true that certain platforms, well, most of them, right? All of them are private companies and can decide what they want or don't want. And so if you're a company that says we have terms of services, we won't allow harassment or hate speech or et cetera, then, they should be held accountable to make sure that they're not allowing that. The problem is there are platforms that are saying we want the hate. Right. And it's our freedom, we're a private entity and we want to allow that. And so that's where it becomes more complicated. Right. So it's not about like not meeting the sort of ambitions that you've created of combating hate. It's that your ambition is to promote and have that hate spread. So for us, it's about, making sure that everybody who enables that specific platform to operate recognize what they're supporting, right? I think there's ways to use one's own freedom of speech to call out bad speech with your good speech. The day that I can't call out bad speech is a day that my freedom of speech is being infringed upon. But also asking companies to say, do you want to be associated? Hosting service X, do you want to host a platform that is, showing videos of people harassing minorities in the street as part of their fundamental reason to exist? So there's a whole set of connected businesses and organizations that I think can, never make it totally disappear, but just make more friction for the hate and the violence to be able to spread. And by the way, we're talking about social media companies, and it's clearly not purely a social media issue. There's broader cultural and societal issues that are contributing to the fact that this has become such a challenge.
Yeah, and back to that business ecosystem, and some of these platforms, you've got programmatic advertising where a legitimate company's message is being placed side by side with this stuff, and that's a whole other group that holds the purse strings on these companies. So I wonder, though, in your work at the ADL, yours personally and your organization, when and how do you decide to take some action? What do you do? I mean, do you see things that get to the point where it sounds like that's a legitimate threat and you report it to officials? Do you go on these sites and counter argument? What exactly is your function, and how do you try to get at this?
Yeah. So with regard to social media, the actions that we're looking for, are consistent with sort of our mission. So if we are identifying an individual or a group who we believe are planning something truly dangerous, we are alerting law enforcement so that they can do what they need to do to investigate that, right? It's like my subway in New York, right? If you see something, say something. That's what I hear all the time over often muffled tones, but we're pretty clear, and we share those types of threats with law enforcement. At the same time, we are also providing sort of public education so that people know how to identify this in the first place. So, for example, we have a hate symbols database on our website. So if somebody, comes across graffiti in the real world or a meme on one of their social media platforms and they don't really know what to make of that, they can use our hate symbols database as a reference guide to understand, all right, in this context, it may actually truly be a problem, or, oh no, it's not that much of an issue because I'm looking at the context around it. So it's almost like tools for people to make better decisions, to understand what they're seeing. But listen, there's also, I think, sometimes things that go beyond sort of social media as the main vector, and recently this comes to mind, a multi-billion-dollar industry that was Kanye West, who changed his name to Ye, right? Here is a man who had more followers on Twitter than there are Jews on the planet Earth, who is promoting the type of anti-Semitism that, it was easy to sort of identify because it's been around for centuries, if not longer. And so in that case, it's a question that we ask the social media company, why are you amplifying this type of hate that we feel has no value other than to incite people to other activity? Or, Adidas, for example, who ended up dropping him, was a question to them, like, is this the person that you want to represent your brand? And I think it's fair to ask those questions of the businesses that benefit from people who are promoting hate, whether that's something they really want to do. So that's just another example of how we kind of jump into action once something occurs.
Well, and so Kanye West, I'm remembering, I think it was the Kanye West when someone hung a banner that said Kanye was right, or that sort of thing, and the ripple effects of this stardom, and the group of people out there who just say, oh well, he's unwell, he's got his issues, but not realizing what he's stirring up in other people who say, yeah, see, there's a successful guy and he's right. And right. I mean, that seems to me that's a huge issue with these high profile people.
Yeah. And I will tell you, we've tracked at least 59 incidents of anti-Semitic incidents that have referenced Kanye West, since he went on his sort of tirade a couple months ago. That means like somebody was assaulted in New York and somebody said Kanye was right. flyers distributed in people's lawns with references to Kanye, right? So sort of leveraging that moment. And, it's still pretty early on, but it just shows like the impact on the ground that those types of statements from influencers have. But here's where I think we ought to remember like the lessons learned from something like that. Is that imagine if somebody who's an influencer like that or in a position of power used their voice to combat that type of hatred, right? To say things that are putting hatred in context, giving people an opportunity to actually be animated by the positive. So technology is agnostic. It's how we use it. And so, the Kanye is also a reminder, I believe, that, important messages of responsibility and accountability can also go viral if we care to make sure that we put a priority on the creation of those messages as well.
It's interesting to hear Oren Segal speak about the First Amendment and in a way offer his own optimistic view of its upsides in his work. Of course, freedom of speech in the United States is one of our most cherished rights. And while we might be dismayed by the way it is abused for evil, Oren counters that this same freedom allows us all to call out hate when we see it, free from any government restrictions. I also think it's important to consider what Oren has to say about the power of celebrity and the dangers presented by the anti-Semitic rants of someone with more social media followers than there are Jews on the planet. We're a celebrity-driven culture, and we should always be on guard about where they might be driving us. Getting back to our conversation, I asked Oren about how members of some of these fringe groups espousing hateful, dangerous ideas are infiltrating mainstream institutions.
And, it's interesting, people look at our work as often as sort of research into issues to shine light on problems. I also view our research as a commitment to optimism and what is possible. And what I mean by that is we issued a report last year that was based on our analysis of Oath Keeper membership lists, right? So there was 38,000 people who had signed up and paid money to become members of the Oath Keepers. And, we went through painstakingly each one of those to try to identify, who are these people? What do they do? What roles do they have in society? And we focused our report and our findings on Oath Keepers in law enforcement, Oath Keepers in the military, and Oath Keepers who are either in office or running for office, because these are sensitive positions that are designed to protect everybody in their communities. And if you have an extremist who believes in the conspiracies that the Oath Keepers believe in, right? These are some of the folks who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, then that seems anathema and inappropriate for people in positions of power. So for us, it was an effort to shed light on the ability of Oath Keepers to infiltrate some of our most precious democratic institutions. But then also, it's an act of belief that communities will hold them accountable, that we will make sure that we lessen that by shedding light on it. And by the way, Bill, we didn't have to dox them. We didn't put the names of everybody out there. We reached out to each individual agency and said, hey, you might want to investigate this. You might have a problem. And then we reached out to investigative journalists who, there's less and less of them in local communities these days, but very much were able to turn, a local lens. And ultimately, a report was about how do we protect our democracy? How do we protect our communities from the ability of extremists to infiltrate our institutions? And so the mere fact of that report to me was an operation of hope, not just an operation of research and education.
It's great. And it also, I think, as you said before, it's the flip side of technology, right? Or these resources you have to do this investigation, to spread the word. I mean, I think, not to just harp on January 6th too much, but I think this whole sort of people in their homes, the crowdsourcing of finding out who these people were was fascinating. These people who just thought it was a sort of a civic duty and sitting down, wait a second, he was wearing that red jacket. I got a picture of him here on Instagram and that's him. It's amazing. So, not to turn us all into like, this police state, the homebody police state, but at the same time, we all can play a role in unearthing this stuff and spreading it. Because again, I one of my concerns for this on this whole subject is that people, and I don't want to say people like me, but people who aren't involved in this don't know it's happening, and it's until some big awful event. It's this insidious thing on these fringes that and these silos that we just don't know about. So I'm glad that you're on here to spread the word, because I'm hoping that a lot of my audience this is news.
It's interesting. I travel around the country quite a bit and talk to people in big cities and smaller towns, and one of the things I've been struck by recently is I think people do know something is going on, but they don't know all the sort of details and how these things are connected, and they don't know what they can do about it. Right? It's overwhelming. Right? Like the normalization of anti-Semitism and bigotry and extremism is almost like climate change, in the sense that it can be way too big for somebody to say, "Oh, I can do something about it." So one of the challenges we have is to say, here's what you can do as individuals so that this is not overwhelming. Because most people realize, yeah, January 6th was a bad sign for our democracy. Or, my uncle seems to be going down these like rabbit holes and is talking about QAnon. Or, there was a hate incident or a hate crime that impacted my community. I do think people are aware, because it leads our headlines, by the way, almost every day as well. I think what they don't know is how to connect those dots and then connect it to, their own world and responsibility and ability to make change on that. And frankly, it's conversations like these, it's outreach, it's education that I think will get us to the point where not only raise that awareness, but give people the tools to say, I want to become part of this fight against hate. And I believe we're getting there too.
No, and you've raised a huge point that we've talked about here at the Optimism Institute. Our mutual friend, Marcy Frank, who writes The Climate Optimist, and she said to me that, one of the things I try to push back on is some people think, well, if you're optimistic, that means you just sit around and you think things are going to get better. Well, no, actually, optimists are the ones who lean forward and try to make it better. And it's the people who feel a sense of doom and helplessness who do nothing. So applied that to climate change, if you think, it's over, we've screwed it up, we've got 30 years to live, let's drive our big cars and then you don't do anything. If you think there's hope, you do something. So you're making the same point in this subject matter. And I'd love to hear you explain to us, help us understand, what could we do? If I leave this call and I go online and I see something, or I see something spray painted down the street that looks a little funny, is it the ADL? Is it local law enforcement? Help us understand how we can be better citizens on this.
Yeah. So, I'll start with your sort of initial point. If somebody sees somebody being targeted in their community, or, graffiti or vandalism, or, I definitely folks need to contact law enforcement, especially if there's a specific risk. We collect this data at ADL as well. So I would encourage, after, again, if law enforcement needs to know immediately, to report this to ADL. We have a website, we're creating an app, we have all sorts of ways to reach out. We have 25 regional offices around the country, because that data is taken seriously. We might be able to help, right, with either context or connect people or provide some services. But also, from my sort of perspective, it's collecting data that you really need people to provide. No one single government entity is going to be able to get all the necessary data. Very sort of blatantly, the FBI hate crime data often doesn't include cities of 100,000 people or more. They just don't report. So we're never getting a true understanding of hate crimes, because it's not a robust enough sort of operation there. Now, hopefully it's going to be getting better. And so individuals can report to law enforcement and report to ADL. But I also think there's other ways beyond just reporting that people can activate on these issues. When you and I spoke briefly prior to this call, I had mentioned that my synagogue was firebombed about a month ago. Somebody who does the work that I do for as long as I've done, it actually, was not surprising in many ways, but it also was a reminder for me about like the impact it has on people in those local communities in a different way because it was mine, right? And I was getting tons of phone calls from friends and family and concerned people who know what I do and saying, is it okay to show up tomorrow? Some basic stuff. But then 2 days later, the synagogue held like almost like a rally, and so many people showed up that there were 3,000 people on the street from different religions, faith groups, ethnicities, all showing up to show support. And that was wonderful. That was the best possible response a community can give in the face of a hate incident. And allyship was the lesson there, right? So when you see somebody else who's targeted and maybe different than you, or targeted for reasons that you may not relate with 100%, being an ally at those times is huge. And then the last thing, and it's not the only thing, but one last thing I want to mention, which is, people's voices are really important. It's not about just showing up to those who are targeted. It's not just about reporting. It's when you see an influencer, the president of the United States, the president of the PTA, right? Somebody in your family who you may be able to reach more likely than, somebody who's an influencer on Twitter. Like, let them know why that is inappropriate. Have that difficult discussion. There are actually tools that help people have difficult discussions with people who they love. And I actually think that makes a huge difference. When you reach the people who are closest to you, they're more willing to listen. And it just starts this ripple effect where we start to denormalize the narratives that are preying upon people.
So imagine, you're Oren Segal, you do the work that you do, and your own synagogue is firebombed. What's amazing to hear is how Oren presents this traumatic personal experience as having a powerfully uplifting aftermath, with more than 3,000 people from all different backgrounds showing up at a rally to demonstrate their support and unity. Oren makes clear the power and importance of allyship in trying to combat hateful behavior. And again, here, I think about that lesson from Fred Rogers' mom. Something scary happens, in this case, the firebombing of his own place of worship. But there's Oren, joined by community members, demonstrating their desire to come together and be helpers. Following this story, I asked Oren a more personal question about his work and how it impacts him. So you have chosen a profession where you are working towards a very noble goal and noble ends, but day to day has got to be really tough. You are seeing things that are directed towards people of your faith. You are seeing the worst of the worst. How do you maintain what seems to be a very positive, forward-looking, lean into this, and not just curl into a ball and just say, I can't do this anymore? You've been at this a while. What is it in your makeup? What is it about your mindset as you go into this that allows you to be the person you are?
So, it's an interesting question when I have to sort of self-reflect in a way that I don't often have the chance to. So thank you for asking that question. I mean, I think, listen, for me, I'm probably a bit of an unreasonable person, which means that I don't shy away quickly from things that I care about. I keep going and going and going, right? Like when I was a kid, if I couldn't make a basket, I'd keep practicing and practicing and practicing until I made that basket. And in some ways, it's just, some people have that. I think I do, which I don't really like taking no for an answer. And so I believe also that at the end of the day, when people are given an option between hate or love, I think people will choose that love, but providing them with that option is the challenge. But more important than perhaps what I inherited from my family or my friends growing up, today in doing this work for as long as I have been surrounded by a community of professionals and experts, within ADL and partner organizations and people around the country who are inspiring me every single day. So, Bill, I am seeing some terrible things every single day, and I am seeing some incredibly hopeful things every single day as well. And that's what helps me keep going, because when you see people dedicating their lives to protecting communities, to pushing back against hatred, even when it's not directed at them specifically, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just the stuff that gets me. Like, to me, that's living in its purest form, is seeing something bad and finding ways to help people. I just don't know what else I'd be doing if not this, Bill. Like, I just can't fathom anything better, which I know sounds weird to folks because it does require seeing the underbelly of society quite a bit. But again, combating that, having opportunities and tools and approaches and scaling that and partners in this fight, oh man, that makes it all better and worth it.
I love hearing Oren describe himself as a bit of an unreasonable person. I think that those among us who get out of bed every day, go out into the world and keep up with the struggle against difficult challenges and bad odds have to be somewhat unreasonable, or they just give up. And regarding his own motivation, I asked Oren what it is in his work that he and his colleagues can point to as tangible examples of success.
So for, the Center on Extremism at ADL in particular, if we were able to provide information about somebody who was about to attack a community and get them arrested, or, provide information that helped got them arrested before they're doing it, that's a very tangible success. I can't pretend that happens every single day, but we're very good at identifying potential threats. And there are many times at the end of the day where we've all, shared a drink and said, I'm glad we found this one today, right? But there's other sort of day-to-day successes, right? Which is, does a community feel that they are now more empowered to respond to hate because we have provided, as an agency, opportunities to go into their schools and provide education about how to identify stereotypes, how to not be an innocent bystander in the face of that, right? So literally reaching people at a youngest age to turn them into allies through education, right? I mean, to me, that's success. Reaching over, millions of students over the, past several years is no small task. And, the building of sort of future allies, I think, is success. I do think that also when we're able to have influencers, whether it's influencers in the community or sort of national influencers, take a stand against hate, not because it was just in response to the latest Charlottesville or insurrection, but to view them as like, this is the way that they can leverage their reach. That's a success too, because either you're promoting hate, you're doing nothing, or you're combating hate. And the more that we could take people out of the middle to promote, positive messages is also a sign of success.
Yeah, and I think those people in the middle need to feel like there is something they can do, that it's not bigger than them, that it's not, back to the climate analogy, that it's not doomed. There are things we can do. So how can somebody, after they hear this conversation, should they be checking out your website and resources that you offer to help people? Is it inviting you into their schools? I love the idea of working with younger people. At some point you go upstream and get people early. And by the way, it's one of those things that does give me hope, seeing the younger generation on all these issues. I mean, I try to explain to my kids that the concept of same-sex marriage when I was their age it was discussed, but it was not going to happen. I mean, it was just, the progress we can make and the viewpoints that a lot of younger people have on a lot of these issues is stunning to me and very encouraging. So what are some of the things that these people in the middle could actually do when they're done listening to this conversation?
Yeah, I think for those who are interested in seeing how they can input into or inform sort of this, what I believe is a movement to combat efforts to undermine democracy and promote hatred, we have 25 regional offices around the country. So I encourage folks to reach out to their local office by visiting our website. It'll show you where those offices are. And inquire with our office, how can they help, or what initiatives are going on? How can they learn more about our work, right? And then over time, there's a range of ways to sort of engage, whether it is bringing our education team into the schools, whether it's creating, opportunities to create not only after something terrible happens, but before something terrible happens, opportunities to engage in the community, to have a discussion, and whether it's other more specific ways that people want to engage, the menu of options will be there once they contact our regional office. But I also want to note another thing that both I view as a success, gives me hope, and is another potential way of engagement. I think there's so much creativity out there. And I see it in all those terrible social media platforms that we've talked about. And for those people who are just naturally good content creators, which frankly is kind of anybody under a certain age, if you really think about it. But, people who are investing a lot of their time on TikTok or whatever platform, we would love to hear from you about what sort of content resonates. And I would love to put people together and find a way to get some real good content creators to discuss with us how they can create content that promotes, positivity or that combats the negativity. I'll be honest, I'm 40 something at this point. I think I'm pretty creative, but I'm not creating the next best sort of viral video on TikTok or anywhere else. But what I do have is an expertise in hate and extremism and how it spreads. And we would love to offer that to content creators who want to take, the challenge of creating content so that more and more people see that regularly instead of just the bad stuff on their feeds.
That's a fantastic idea, and it's sort of fighting fire with fire, right? Like go where they are. And also, you said something earlier about these symbols and terms and groups that a lot of us have never heard of. Just education on that. I mean, I'd read these things. Oh, look at that picture. He's doing that hand gesture that means white supremacy. I'm like, what? And it's all around us, and a lot of us just have no idea. So I think some young people with that, and there are people out there, and I will do my best because that's a great idea, because I think you have to go sort of where the enemy is, if you will. I mean, you've got to combat that depraved creativity with the folks who, again, given a target, given an objective, given hope that what they are working on could actually make a difference, they'll do it. And a lot of those folks are not thinking about it. They're trying to get more likes and, whatever, sell a product or whatever. But if they had this opportunity to point something in a helpful direction, I think it's got huge potential. I love that idea.
Yeah, so definitely reach out to ADL for that, because we're open for some content creators to see how we could be supportive. And it also just strikes me that one of the things people don't realize about the bad stuff is that it is a form of entertainment. Right? Extremists use irony and humor and memes and, streaming their activity in order to gain, engage communities and get more eyeballs on their content. And I actually think that perhaps those who might be inclined to be part of that apparatus, if they saw that there was a movement that was providing alternative and better and hopeful messages, there are some of those skilled people that might join that other fight. They just don't have that option yet. So we need to give people more options. I generally still believe people will make the option that's best for their community at the end of the day if they have that option.
And speaking of what's best for a community, one thing obviously we all can do is vote and put the right people in office. You were in front of Congress late last year. What are you asking of our elected officials at this point? What could they be doing to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, so with elected officials, you hope to see that they will use their positions of power and leadership to consistently and clearly condemn any of the sort of normalization of bigotry and violence that we're seeing. That shouldn't sound like a very hard thing to do, but it's a little harder these days, it seems. But that's sort of like baseline. But also, we have encouraged government officials and policymakers to make sure that there are better laws about reporting hate crimes. I mean, I can't underscore this enough. Data drives policy. The only way we can solve a problem is if we know what the problem is, if we have the information and the data around it. And so we always encourage more and more, states to make sure that their law enforcement agencies are actually reporting hate crimes, as just one example. Also to, domestic terrorism on the rise. We We're hoping to see the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would include, again, the need for more reporting, but also more resourcing, not just of government, but of government providing resources to other organizations that are dedicated to combating violent extremism. How do people get involved in it in the first place, right? Off-ramps and prevention methods. I mean, there's a role for government to either fund or, use their position to support those types of initiatives. And then lastly, I would say, is a question that I think is difficult, but we're asking elected officials in a polarized world, in a polarized society, to stop pointing fingers at one another so much, and maybe look inward. Because I'll tell you, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, I don't care what part of the political spectrum you're on. But if you call out the people closest to you, who are part of your group that you affiliate with, they're going to listen to you in a way that they won't if somebody from the other side is calling them out. So instead of pointing fingers across the aisle, let's point fingers inside, because I think we're going to be able to reach people in more meaningful ways if we do more of that.
Well, Oren, we're coming up against the end of our time. And as you know, I try to profile folks working on difficult challenges with a sense of hope and optimism. And I can't think of a more difficult challenge than the one you're working on. But I'm personally taking a lot of hope and inspiration from your energy, your intelligence, and the fact that you get up and do this work every day. It's truly inspiring. And I can't thank you enough. And I encourage everyone listening to this conversation to get involved, speak up, take these actions. We will post links to your work and your 25 regional offices. And I just can't thank you and your colleagues enough for everything you're doing.
Bill, thanks so much for having me. This moment in time we're in is not going to be remembered for the hate and the violence, but what good people did to push back against it. So really good talking to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Oren. I love Oren's idea of a casting call for content creators who'd be interested in helping out with ADL's important work. I think he's really onto something here, and if anyone listening to this might have this kind of talent or know someone else who does, I hope you'll give it some thought. As Oren says, people will do what's best for communities when given a choice. And presented with the binary option, they'll choose love over hate. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky episode with Oren Segal of the Anti-Defamation League. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing to Blue Sky and also following the Optimism Institute on social media. And if you have a minute to leave us a review, rating, or any feedback on our work, we'd really appreciate hearing what you have to say. Until next time, I'm the host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.